What if we all had a better understanding of the process of death and even what happens after death, just the way our ancestors always had? What if we actually found peace in our own personal death and in the loved one's graduation from this lifetime? Because ultimately, death is an illusion, even if their lives and deaths were tragic. Today, on the Sovereign Women Movement podcast, we're going to explore the Kundalini Yogic understanding of death, of suicide, of sudden death, like overdoses and car accidents. We're going to look at what happens during and after we take our last breath so that you can build your capacity to be present with those that are dying, with those that have died, and to support yourself through grief recovery, all from a yogic perspective. Satnam and welcome, beautiful, beautiful sovereign woman. Welcome to today's podcast episode of the Sovereign Woman podcast, where this entire week we have been going down deep the rabbit hole. And my intention is for us not to create more fear within us. I think none of us can say that we sign up every day to learn about what death is and to understand it better. Because I think if you're like me, I was so fearful of even talking about it because I felt like, oh my God, if I talk about it, I'm just gonna attract it or align with it. And it's just something that always made me so, so, so afraid. But the thing is that the more that I started to face this fear, the more I started to realize what an illusion it is. And the more the right teachers and mentors came to me to help alleviate those anxieties within me. Because when you can be a woman that is okay and neutral about the fact that death is an illusion, you can really be a beacon of light for others that are moving through that transition, or even find a lot of peace from those that have left their bodies. For me, my Kundalini Yoga therapist recent certification program on death and grief and the journey of the soul really lifted thousands of pounds of weight, of guilt, of shame, of fear around the ancestors that had transitioned, worry. And it gave me a lot of confirmation from a lot of the things that I felt intrinsically to be truth about death. Because I myself have worked a lot with plant medicine work, with Mother Ayahuasca, with all these different capacities of mushrooms that absolutely help you really connect with the ethereal world, with the spiritual world. I've worked with also the medicine San Pedro in Peru, where you're given these previews of what an illusion this whole reality is, and the truth and the essence of what you are, which is an eternal soul. And so when I went to Kundalini Yoga, when I finished my course this year on death and grief, it was like a confirmation of all of the things that I had personally experienced, and then also the people around me. Because, like I shared with you in the last two podcast episodes, my own mother has had two near death experiences. And from many of the stories, of the thousands of stories of near death experiences, the similarities, you cannot deny them. The synchronicities and what people share after they've gone through this experience is pretty obvious, and it's very, very different than what I was told growing up, and especially as it relates to religion. So when I started to really face these fears and understand that death ultimately is an illusion, it alleviated me from so much fear and a lot of trauma. Because as a child growing up, when I was 8 years old, like I shared with you, my favorite aunt in the entire world transitioned, and she left this world, and it was a very dark time in our family's life because my mom went into a deep state of depression after that. And through that, I really developed a huge, tremendous amount of fear. That's one of the things is why, as to why for me, El Día de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, is a very important day celebration. Because what I do is we make a beautiful dinner. We invite, I invite my family over if I'm not in Mexico, because I love being in Mexico for Dia de los Muertos, where they really take the celebration to a whole other level, because it's a celebration. It's not, yes, you're going to feel sad and crying, and that's okay, but you're literally celebrating the fact that death is an illusion and that you can still connect with your ancestors at all times, and you're celebrating all the gifts that they gave you. And I think that's very, very important for small children. Like this year, I was back home because I just gotten back from Costa Rica. So we had a celebration here at my house. And I invited my sisters and my parents, and they brought my nieces and nephews. And it was so beautiful for them to ask questions, to look at our altar and ask questions about the ancestors, to ask questions about death, so that we can alleviate their fears. And as a child, imagine if I would have received the consoling um, words from even my mom or someone else, it would have changed my whole perspective as an adult. But of course, my mom couldn't do that, because when my aunt transitioned when I was a young girl, she had a deep state of depression. And that's also to be validated. Like, I talked a lot more about that, about grief yesterday and yesterday's podcast episode, which you can go check out here in my YouTube channel. So your emotions are valid. It's okay for you to have this fear of this word known as death. But what I'm here to share with you really will help you become more aware and develop the resiliency that you need to release yourself from guilt. And especially because we're going to talk about suicide today. We're going to talk about overdoses, what happens to those that have taken their life or who have died tragically. Like, so many people are dying right now with overdoses or car accidents. Those things need to be spoken about, because when we don't process grief and when we have very tragic deaths in our families, those are literally the recipe for basically passing down these emotional patterns of pain down the DNA to the next generation and to the next generation. The way that we disrupt the pattern is by allowing ourselves to heal from the grief. And grief doesn't have a timetable. Grief is very different for many different people. In fact, there are some people that are always sad, and then there are some people. I had a client who, her daughter told me that when she was grieving the death of her father, she went through like 3 months of just laughing, completely laughing, where people thought were like she was going crazy. And she realized that that was the way she developed how she responded to grief. There's a awesome comedian who I love. He's from Mexico, Escamilla. He actually, even in his show, he does a lot of jokes around the death of his father. But he also talks about how he is seeing a therapist full time, and how the therapist basically has shown him that the way he deals with his grief is by making jokes. And some people don't think it's funny, but that's the way he deals with it. So there's no right or wrong way to deal with grief. Grief is an incredible teacher. But the thing is that we have to learn to feel it and heal it. And if we don't, then we need to seek out help, which is what we do mainly in my Sovereign Woman Group Academy. It's a group coaching program where we disrupt ancestral karmic patterns of emotional pain. We have to seek out this help, because if we don't, if we numb it, or we just don't acknowledge it, or we pretend it's not there, we pretend it doesn't hurt us. And men are really, really good at this. Now, my program is only for women, but men really need the support and help as well. So if we ignore it, then not only are we going to be living with that horrific, tragic pain within us, but then our children are going to also basically inherit that as well. So we want to get to a point where we can face these fears and learn from these yogic masters, this yogic perspective, which, by the way, when I started to learn about it, I was like, oh my God, this is just the way the Aztecs think, or the Mayans, all of these beautiful indigenous tribes, even like the Egyptians, who not only did not believe in death, but they prepared themselves for death, because they knew that there was a whole other life right after death, that they had a lot of control if they learned how to live and die consciously. So today's podcast is really the climax of what we've been talking about this entire week. First, looking at death from an astrological perspective of the things that need to die, especially from the season that we're in, the Scorpio season. Next, yesterday, or not yesterday, the day before yesterday, when we started to talk about deeply the spiritual perspective of death from a point of view of A Course in Miracles and what an illusion it actually is. And today I'm going to share with you some science. And I'm also going to share with you the yogic spiritual perspective of death. And we're going to get into, like I said, suicide and things of that nature to help alleviate anything, any fears or any thoughts you might have in reference to believing that maybe an ancestor is suffering in an afterlife. So let's start with first understanding what happens when we die from a yogic understanding of death. So basically, death happens when the breath stops, when you take your last breath. It's a beautiful thing to remember, that we are always in between the first breath we took and the last breath we'll ever take. We're dancing in between these two phases of our life, right? And what happens is the physical body no longer has any power to move or to grow, and it begins to decay. That's what death is. So the subtle consciousness of the soul then begins to separate from the physical body. This is why the first 17 days after the person takes their last breath are crucial. We're going to talk about that. And it is especially crucial if the person did die suddenly or if the person decided to take their life. And so the subtle consciousness of the soul begins to separate. The first 3 to 4 days, this consciousness can actually hang out around the body. And that's why even in in Catholicism, in Mexico, when I was there with my grandma, they call it a velorio, which is when people basically they lay out her body. And in Mexico, you lay out their bodies in the homes. You don't take them to a funeral home. So in my grandma's house, there have been like 8 different deceased bodies that they have preyed upon. And I remember when I was there that you're not supposed to fall asleep. You're supposed to basically pray for them. I think for them it's 12 days straight, but you're not supposed to fall asleep, especially I believe it's the first to 2 days. And correct me if I'm wrong. But I didn't even ask my mom. It was one of the ladies that was there praying for my grandma. I said, why do we stay awake? Why? Because it's weird the way people deal with their grief, right? Do what you got to do. But like we're there praying. A lot of the people that were there, they're on antidepressants and pharmaceuticals, which they're not really feeling what's going on. Then there are other people who are completely drunk and wasted because in these funerals in Mexico, you got food, you got alcohol. So I was like, oh my God, how are they going to remember everything that's happening here? But the lady told me that the reason we're supposed to stay near her body or the deceased person's body was because spirits and demons can take over it the first few days. And I was like, oh my God, no one leave grandma's side. Everyone stay near her. I honestly do not believe that, of course, but this is why so many of us are afraid of death. So many of us are afraid of the purgatory. I'm going to talk about that right now. It's religion. Religion has caused us to be so afraid of it that we still believe that even after death, that God is going to judge us or that there are still ways that these demons and spirits can take over. I'm not saying that these traditions are not beautiful because I think they're beautiful, but like the reasoning behind it is kind of crazy. And this is why again we all live in so much guilt. So the first 3 to 4 days, there's a consciousness that hangs out. It can hang out around the body. This is very different though if the person did die suddenly or if they died like in a car accident or an overdose. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the consciousness might still have some kind of attachment. So like in Sikh tradition, what they do is they cremate the body immediately because in Sikh tradition is the tradition that is correlated to Kundalini Yoga teachings as well. And so that's why they cremate the body immediately so that they could begin the process of allowing the soul to basically continue on to its next assignment or continue on to the journey of what happens after the death. But in either event, the subtle consciousness maintains this connection to the physical body. And in those first few days, this is why we really learn to pray. We do our rituals around this time, very crucial time. The first 17 days are the most important days of someone's death because what happens in the death process is first, there's the 5 elements that start to return themselves back into Mother Earth. So we know this in yogic technology as the tattvas, which are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And so these 5 tattvas, when they're strong, when you're alive, right? They're powerful. You can resist all stress. You can resist trauma. You can resist illness. You don't gotta get like you don't live in illness and sickness. But when you die, all of these tattvas start to basically return themselves back to the earth. So the earth, water, fire, air, everything starts to dissolve itself. But then you have to remember that you, as a consciousness, you're actually also 10 energetic bodies. So you're not just the physical body. Most of us think we're just like a physical body. We're actually 10 energetic bodies. This is one of the things that I teach a lot in Kundalini Yoga in my women's community, Satori, because what we are is we think we're just a physical body. And what we need to understand is that everything is energy. And if we really understood ourselves in energy, this is why Kundalini Yoga is so precise and exact, because what it does is that it gives you the perfect meditations, breath sequences, ways to position your hand to keep all 10 bodies really, really healthy. Why you want to keep these 10 layers of your bodies healthy is because they all have a specific function. Like, so for example, like the mind is not just one mind. The mind is basically three aspects of the mind. There's a positive mind, a negative mind, and a neutral mind. And the negative mind is not like bad. It serves a purpose. It's just when we don't have it activated or we don't have a healthy negative mind, because the negative mind protects you. But we have specific meditations and kriyas that actually work to help strengthen that part of you, that energetic part of you. So just the way that tattvas dissolve, earth goes into water when you die, water into fire, fire into air, air into ether, space into thoughts, thoughts into emotions, emotion into consciousness, and consciousness into light. So do your 10 bodies. So now what happens in death when you take your last breath is the three aspects of the mind, the positive, the negative, and the neutral, they basically dissolve into the universal mind because there's a collective universal consciousness as well. Then the physical body, those are that's comprised of the five tattvas, the earth, air, fire, they dissolve into the tattvas, into the air, into the earth, into the fire. Then what is known as our arc line, which is women have two arc lines. We have one that goes from nipple to nipple, and then we have one that goes from ear to ear. Men just have one. So it's kind of like a halo. And this connects you to your book of life, to the Akashic record. So doing specific meditations with the arc line helps you activate those memories, that connection. But when you die, the arc line completely dissolves and it dissolves into light, into basically more light. Then you have your auric body. That's what we're working on right now in our women's community, Satori Vitality and Spirituality. The aura is an electromagnetic field that protects you, and there's an aura around every human being, every plant, even Mother Earth has an aura. And what happens with your aura when you die is that it dissolves into light as well. So it just turns into light too. And then what happens with the connection with your pranic body, which is basically your pranic body is your breath, it's prana. This releases and the prana merges into universal prana as well. Then you got the subtle body. The subtle body is really, really important because the subtle body is like your soul's best friend. So you come into this world, it takes energy to come into this world. And when you come into this to the body, you come with a subtle body and the soul. And the subtle body carries all of your samskaras. Basically, these are like grooves of imprints, what eventually turns into your DNA that is carried from past lifetimes or also from your ancestors. Like basically, if they were not able to process trauma, these samskaras attach themselves to the subtle body, which then attaches itself to the soul, which then that's how the soul births into the physical body. But when you die, the subtle body now carries the soul into what is known as the blue ethers. And I'm going to talk to you more about that. What are the blue ethers? What are the different stages? Because it's not just yogic science that proves that there's an afterlife with these different stages of the ethers. Like I said, even in Aztec indigenous traditions, there's what is known as the Mictlan, and it's basically the different phases of the afterlife and what happens after you take your last breath. There's 9 different phases for them. In yogic science, we have 5 or 4 different ethers. Really, the 5th one is basically you don't come back into this body. But it's not just yoga perspective. If you look at spiritual traditions throughout the world, they all talk about these different layers of consciousness that we still go through after we take our last breath. So a lot happens after you take your last breath. We just think, nothing happens afterwards. So then what happens after that, after you're done, the subtle body carries a soul body. Then you have a radiant body, and that basically penetrates and dissolves into the universal radiant body. So as you can see, these layers start to dissolve themselves and we start to return back to light. We start to return back home to God herself. So then as it relates to the after death, though, when you take your last breath, this is why we as yogis, and you have many yogis that are great representations of this, like Gandhi. Gandhi is a perfect example of this. So Gandhi always chanted the sound frequency Ra. That was his sound frequency. That was his meditation. And he chanted that every day because that was the way he was preparing for death. And so when they killed him, when they shot him, the last thing he said was Ra. That was his last sound frequency. Why? Because that gave him energy and chi to process and to stay conscious in the afterlife. So after he takes his last breath, you go into the first ether, which we're going to talk about right now, which then you can still consciously make decisions with God as to whether you want to come back and reincarnate or not. Because some that have learned all of the lessons in the university don't have to reincarnate again. And in fact, they become very powerful ancestors that assist us from the ethereal world, like Jesus Christ, or many of your guides, or even ancestors that have graduated. That's why they're still helping you from there. So let's talk a little bit about the ethers so we can understand what happens after death, because this is really, really important. So after the last breath, during the first 17 days, the soul and the subtle body, they prepare to cross this electromagnetic field of the earth. And this is where I wouldn't say souls get stuck, but this is where some souls hang out that have unfinished business. So if they are still forgiveness work or something that needs to be completed, this is kind of where they're hanging out or connecting with us from. Now, they're not suffering because the soul doesn't have emotions anymore, right? They're getting our attention so that we don't repeat these lessons, right? Or maybe they have like this unfinished business that needs to be told or whatever, but they're not suffering. But what happens during the next part of the 17 days is that typically the soul and the subtle body prepare to cross the electromagnetic field of the earth, and then they begin the journey into basically what is known as the blue ethers. And there's 4 levels of the blue ethers because the 5th one is graduation. Before we go in through the blue ethers, we experience this before we experience perfect union with God. And so those who have a spiritual teacher or guide, they actually get help at this point, at this very first blue ether, because the first blue ether is what everybody talks about when they have a near-death experience, where there's an assessment. Some religions call that like purgatory. So sadly though, religion, and my mom has a beautiful little aunt in Mexico. She's my aunt too, obviously. She's my late grandfather's sister, and she's in her late 80s, early 90s, I believe. And she has a terrifying fear of dying. And the reason she feels terrified of dying is because she's afraid of the purgatory. She's afraid of the assessment. She's afraid that God is going to send her to hell. And that's why she's so terrified of dying. And the whole thing about this is that it's so incorrect and untrue. And that's why I'm telling you, if you listen to my podcast on the spiritual perspective of death, we have got to change our relationship to God. You might say, if we're not afraid of God, and if we don't think something bad is going to happen to us at the assessment, then all of us are going to be bad people here. That's not true. The reason why people are bad people here is because they're afraid of God. If you were not afraid of God, and if you knew God was a loving God that did not judge, that God was not like a man that sits on a throne and crosses his hands all day and says, this is what you're doing bad, this is what you did good. If we released that religious programming, we would be at peace with living, and we would be at peace with the illusion of death. Because what happens in the assessment is, in all near-death experiences, there's not one near-death experience where someone says, I went and God looked at all the bad things I did. No, there was a review. It was like a flash when I went through my own ayahuasca experience or San Pedro experience, ayahuasca especially. The first ceremony I ever did with Mother Ayahuasca, I really did believe that I died. I didn't, because when you work with plant medicines, especially with Mother Ayahuasca, you lose control of your body and consciousness for a long time, 2 to 4 hours. So what I experienced was complete leaving of the body. I saw a flash of a lot of the things that happened to my life, but just like A Course in Miracles says, it was like the things that I thought were a big deal were nothing compared to some of the small things that would happen in my life that were a really big deal, whether they created trauma or they were victories. That's really what I envisioned. And when I saw, it was like this big flash of everything that I had went through in my life and even past lifetimes. And then I ended up, just like way I explained it to you, in my own ceremony, I dissolved into the universal consciousness. I was in the cosmos. I was everything. I was the cosmos. I was the universe. And there was never something fearful. There was never, it was scary, obviously, because I wasn't in my body, but there was never a God. There was only light and love. And this is why there's a lot of talk right now about psychedelics being used in the help when someone is dying. So being able to bring MDMA, LSD, Mother Ayahuasca, mushrooms, and being able to administer them to someone who is dying to help them with the death process. I think that's something that's going to be regulated and legal in the next 10 years for sure. Because even psychedelics, we're going through a big revolution where the FDA is getting ready to approve them as a legal use for medicine. So they're just the way there's birth doulas that help women with birthing, and they're very connected and sensitive to the process of birth. There are also death doulas, and these death doulas help people transition in the and through their death process. So the assessment part that we go through is more of a, what were you sent for? How did you do? You know, did you follow your life purpose or not? You know, it's a very few minutes, seconds probably, that we get to really see all of this, but it's never, you did this bad, you're going to hell. You know, that is never the case. In fact, when we talk about suicide and sudden deaths, you'll be assured of this, because even in suicide or sudden deaths, God is not punishing you. Religion says God will punish you and you will go to hell if you commit suicide. Look, the truth is that there are some people that it is very painful for them to live in their body. Look, it is not God's will for any one of us to die. God did not create death, but we have free will in this physical form. So if you decide to take your body, then that was your decision. But that is not going to be God's, there is not going to be a wrath of punishment from God for you doing that. When people die suddenly, like if they overdose or if there's a tragic accident that takes their life immediately, what happens in a yogic perspective is they don't get to go through the process of the blue ethers. What happens is that they immediately reincarnate into another body, which is why in the cases of suicide or in the cases of sudden death, we can do a lot for them. We can do ritual, we can do specific chanting. I had to do this for my grandma because my grandma had a lot of unfinished business here, and she died of disease and older age, right? But she had a lot of unfinished business where she was appearing to my mom and really coming to her and talking to her. She would not physically appear to me. I just sensed her energetically. And for me, my communication with the ancestors is through meditation, through visuals, through signs, especially through hummingbirds. Hummingbirds, I always know when there's a hummingbird around me, that is an ancestor trying to get my attention. So I literally stop what I'm doing and I pay attention to what my thoughts are in that moment, and they will always connect with something that I'm supposed to be listening to from one of my ancestors. So the thing about this is that we still need to change our relationship with God, and we need to stop believing that just because someone decided to take their life or that they died suddenly, that all of a sudden they're suffering in an afterlife. That cannot be more wrong or farther from the truth than what the truth actually is. And so this is what is known as, in Kundalini Yoga, it's known as the Dharam Raj, or these are the minutes right at the time of death. When we last take our last breath, the Dharam Raj is basically this assessment. And all of us, we judge ourselves, right? But it's in this first blue ether that we have a chance to really evaluate. It's not judge, it's to evaluate what do we want to do in our next lifetime that we didn't get done, right? What was unfinished business? In fact, if there are any lessons that did not get finished during life, the soul has a chance during the first 70 days to actually complete those lessons under his or her spiritual guide. That's why they also say that when you transition, you have all of your family members, your guides, the deities, perhaps Jesus Christ, Buddha, the Virgen de Guadalupe, your husband that had already transitioned, they're there waiting for you. And the reason that they're waiting for you is because they're there to assist you, to help you complete those lessons with the guidance. Now, this is why I had to do that ritual for grandma, because she still had a lot of undone work. And it was so beautiful because after I did that ritual with a specific Kundalini Yoga meditation and mantra, I envisioned like these cords. Literally, there was a cord stuck that was keeping grandma in connection with the ethereal, with the earth and with the people around her. So when I did this ritual, I did it in the presence of where she usually slept in my mom's room, and this prayer, and I literally saw that cord dissolve into pure divine light. And then when it dissolved into pure divine light, I saw my grandmother smiling. I saw her then come next to grandpa, which grandpa had died a long time ago. He died when he was in his early 30s. And I saw them holding hands, stepping into the light with my other ancestors accompanying them. And then what was so beautiful was that I received confirmation that what I had experienced was true. And it happened. I hadn't even told my mom that I did this ritual for grandma. But the next day, she tells me how grandma came and spoke to her in a dream, how there were these forces that were trying to just like take over her. And grandma comes and releases these dark forces from my mom's dream and literally just looks at her in the state of like, you're okay and I'm okay. You're okay and I'm okay. And this happened right after I had done this ritual for my grandma, because grandma had a very hard time leaving her body. And the reason why we have a hard time, because it takes a lot of energy to leave the body as well as to come into the body, was because there was a lot of forgiveness work she still had to do. When we don't forgive, death can be very, very painful. And, that's why we come into this university ultimately, to forgive. So the first 17 days, the guides will be there to assist. And then this completion of lessons takes place either in the first or in the second blue ether. So depending on the ripeness of the soul. In the first blue ether, the soul can really purify itself. In the second blue ether, it can continue to go to get deeper learning. So when the soul and the subtle body graduate then to the second blue ether, there's an opportunity to be a guide for other souls. The soul and the subtle body then can reach out from that place and actually help others. And then we have the third blue ether, and that's where grandma went to. So she went from the first ether to the second ether, because as she went to the second ether, then she became a really powerful ancestor that now helps us tremendously every single day. She wasn't lost. She wasn't suffering in the blue ether. She just needed to get her point across and what needed to be done and what lessons needed to be closed out. Now, the third blue ether is the most refined ether. That's where the human being can even access while alive. So near-death experiences. This last one my mom had, I really believe that she accessed this third ether. Yogis, I have accessed this third ether in my meditation practice. Does it happen a lot? No, but I can tell you that I absolutely remember when it happens, because this is how the yogis found this process of death and how they were able to access the afterlife. Same things with the Egyptians. Same thing with the Aztecs and the Mayans. The process of after death is actually the same as the life. So what they would do is they would meditate. They would use special jewels, special temples, right? And Kundalini Yoga is a Kriya Yoga. So they would meditate with these specific meditations so they could astral project, so that they could travel between dimensions, just the way our brother Jesus Christ. So some of us, when we go into deep meditation, we can actually enter the third ether, and we can open up the wisdom and the knowledge in the third ether, because the blue ether in the third ether, this is of the master and of the angel. So while we're alive, people who develop the consciousness of a master or an angel through your meditation practice, they've penetrated through the third blue ether already with their meditative mind. So that's why the ancient ancestors like the Egyptians and the Aztecs and the Mayans, they prepared for death in life by meditating. And all of us are so afraid of death or even meditation. So in the process of death, a soul basically could navigate those first two ethers very easily during the first 17 days. And then they may end up in the third ether if they truly have completed all of their lessons. Because the third blue ether is basically the realm of the self-realized soul. of the enlightened soul. It's a soul who can reach out and touch other souls to guide them in the past, present, or future. I never really understood the death of my teacher. My teacher, Guru Jagat, transitioned about 2.5 years ago. She was my age, a badass. I mean, to me, she was just starting her life. She had just gotten married, and she died in the most craziest way. Like I still can't believe it, you know. But she was such a master, and she was such a incredible soul that my only peace comes in thinking that she's way more powerful in the third ether, and she's helping us more from there than she could have ever helped us in the physical. Because she's alive, obviously, because death is an illusion, and she's still teaching, just the way my teacher Jogi Bhajan still teaches. You can connect with him, and my teachers in Kundalini Yoga therapist school and the program that I'm taking. First of all, every credit that I take counts for me and to become a nurse. So we're not talking about just new age things of that nature. But my teachers are doctors. They're people they're Western doctors. They're women who are around a lot of death, a lot of sickness, a lot of illness, and they're yoga therapists, Kundalini yoga therapists as well. And I just love it because when I talk to them, they're like, oh yeah, Jogi Bhajan just taught me this today. Or Jogi Bhajan, you can connect with them and he'll teach you that. Or ask questions, and Guru Jagat, it's very common knowledge, very common sense. And intrinsically, I knew that was the truth, but I was like, oh my God, I don't want to say this out loud because it sounds crazy. But now, like, receiving these confirmations from these people that I absolutely respect and admire, I'm like, okay, so it wasn't crazy. So this is actually the truth, So there's some souls, like you might think, why did they die all of a sudden? No one dies accidentally. We all choose our own death because God did not create death. It is not God's will for anyone to die because God did not create death. So we choose our death. Always. There was a guy at my grandma's funeral who cracks me up to this day. He had been shot 9 times one time, ran over, and I mean, like he should have died like 5 times. And he was telling my husband and my dad the story of his life, and then he ends it with, in this world, only those that choose to die die. If you choose to die, you're gonna die. If you don't choose to die, you're gonna continue to live, because that was him. He went through the worst stuff in the world, but he would always be like, oh man, I want to live. I'm willing to live. I'm willing to live. And here he is still. So depression is a very serious illness, because depression, unconsciously, we hate our life so much. We hate this physical experience so much that we're unconsciously like, I'd rather die. And if that's what you're unconsciously thinking, well, God's like, well, that's what she wants to do, and I'm gonna go ahead and let her, right? So God does not will for us to die. You choose that when you're ready, right? The masters, now that's a completely different story, because the masters, they consciously live, so they consciously die. In fact, most masters know when their death is upon them, and they don't suffer. God just says, take your last breath and let's go, right? It's not, they don't go through disease or they don't go through all that other stuff, but they're also consciously living so that they could consciously die as well. So some souls hang out in this third ether so that they can help other souls. These are very enlightened souls. I really believe my teacher Guru Jaga was at that level, especially with the amount of meditation she did. Now Jogi Bhajan, 1,000%, he's at that level. But you don't have to stay there in the third ether. You still have the fourth blue ether, which you can graduate to as well. So after the third blue ether, then you have the fourth blue ether, which is reserved for those really incredible, amazing souls. These are the souls that guide humanity. We're talking about Guru Nanak, Jesus Christ. We're talking about Buddha. These souls are never going to take form again. That's why it's so funny that people think that, Jesus Christ is going to come out of the sky and save our asses. Like, no. Christ consciousness has to be born in you. And you allow this to be born in you through forgiveness. We talked a lot about that yesterday, that one of the things that death does do for us is that at least, the Holy Spirit can use it for a pathway to forgiveness for other people, right? For the people that stay behind. But the fourth ether is where, these really divine masters hang out. And they are never going to reincarnate in the body again. but their consciousness, it's so clear and so realized that they radiate from this fourth blue ether across centuries. Think about Jesus Christ. We're still talking about him. Think about Buddha, right? And then give guidance and they give hope and love to humanity. This is why you can access Jesus Christ at any moment of your day. This is why you can connect to Buddha, to our La Virgen de Guadalupe, to whatever you believe in. These are graduated souls that came and showed us the way that now are there to assist you. And this is why you have miraculous healings with our brother Jesus Christ, with Buddha, if you just call upon them. Now, after the fourth blue ether, there's just pure union. This is either known as the fifth blue ether, or basically a state of consciousness of no separation from God. There's absolute oneness. And really, that's the end of the soul's journey across time and space. So this is why during the first 17 days, it's very important that we have ritual for the deceased ones. One of the things that I think is the saddest thing that happened, this is why so many people are going through so much depression and grief, the pandemic. When people were supposedly dying of the virus, they were not, their loved ones were not even around or were not allowed to be with them. Many of these people, let me just fix my camera here. Give me a second here because the camera decided to do funny things on me. I'm back here now. Right. So, it's very sad because in the pandemic, they didn't receive ritual. They didn't receive prayer. These people were, if you don't believe in cremation and all of a sudden they cremate your body and then they don't even let your family see you right before you die, that is a horrific agony and grief, not only for those that transitioned, but also for those that stay behind. Now, they're not going to feel this grief afterlife, right? Or pain, but we as their loved ones can do so much to help them here. What we do in Kundalini Yoga is basically we use sound current, and there's a specific sound current that we use, that we chant, that is known as Akaal, that we do this for 17 days after the soul leaves the body. Because remember, the first 17 days, they're going through the ethers, they're going through the different stages. So you want to assist them. If they had like a sudden death, or if there was suicide, murder, things of that nature, then you want to assist them to follow what we call in Kundalini Yoga, we say follow the snow, to really look for that light. And when you chant a call, this is a very sacred sound frequency. I'll actually post a link to it below. For the first 17 days, that's what releases them from the attachment to the body and also from the attachments of the earthly things that hold them back. So we practice during the first 17 days these prayers, these mantras, and we even practice them prior to their death. If someone doesn't die suddenly, obviously, if they're going through disease, to help prepare them for and face death. Because what happens is that we need to touch our spirits in this way, in God's connection, so that we can have a journey of the afterlife that is very beautiful and epic, and that really allows us to make these decisions on whether we want to come back or not. So this phase is really, really important in the first 17 days, because the 17-day process is the soul can now detach from the body, right? It can now leave and penetrate through the electromagnetic field of the earth. During the first 17-day process, we ask, does the soul have a guide to help on the journey through the blue ethers? During the first 17 days, there could be lessons that the soul needs to learn, right? So we work through these ethers to allow the soul to continue onto its journey, or to come back and return after the journey of the ethers into their next assignment. Now, I want to reiterate again that it's important for the surviving people to avoid any thoughts or beliefs related to any negative outcome regarding the soul when death is by suicide, when death is by overdose, when death is by all of a sudden leaving suddenly, like murder or an accident. Sometimes a soul is way too sensitive to the frequencies of this time. And this creates unbearable pain that you and I, maybe you have had thoughts like that. I've never had thoughts like that of taking my own life or suicide or anything like that. But I definitely know people that have, and I know But even though I cannot understand it, I know how painful it is for them. And some of the most beautiful people on the outside, some of the most people that are the happiest on the outside are the ones that struggle the most with their inner pain, with their mind. I mean, there's so many stories like that. But never, never, if this person decides to take action to leave their body, to free up the pain, the main consideration for us is to have no judgment about the cause of death and to provide the frequency necessary to release the soul from the magnetic field of the earth. So to be able to chant like a call, or to do the rituals that you practice to help the soul find this light and connect with the divine, because that's all that's waiting for them. There is no hell or purgatory or places where God is then going to continue to punish you. And I know that the argument always is, if we don't believe in hell and we don't believe in a punishing God, then all of us are going to misbehave. Don't you think we're all misbehaving already because we believe in a punishing God and because we believe that there's a hell? That's really the reason why. If we allowed ourselves to release that mentality, we would be way more at peace. And we also wouldn't keep passing down the emotional pain that comes from these tragic deaths. Because let me tell you something, suicide, overdoses, tragic deaths like car accidents, if we do not get the grief healing we need, and if we still believe that the soul and our loved one is suffering in an afterlife, it is going to be very difficult for us to heal. And then guess what? Based on epigenetics, we're going to pass that emotional pain to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. I mean, if my mom suffered so much when my aunt died, and she died of cancer, and it was a long process, I can't even imagine the pain of losing someone you love suddenly, tragically, or if they took their life. Because there's an immense amount of guilt that the people that stay behind carry with them. That if they learned how to process and if they understood the process of death and the afterlife, they would easily relieve themselves from. So the soul does not suffer and it is not punished for suicide. And even when it comes to sudden deaths or car accidents or overdoses, what we do know in yogic science is that if it is a sudden death, like a car accident, like overdose, then that soul was being called to their next assignment, and they basically transitioned into that next assignment very quickly. They don't even go through the process of the blue ethers. So it is still very important for you, though, to chant for them 17 days afterwards. Why? Because so they could have a better experience in their next lifetime. That is why it is said that when babies are born, they're crying. Why are they crying? Because they're remembering all the things that they just went through in their past lifetime. So what we could do, and this is why between the ages of 0 to 7, we can remember a lot of our past lifetimes. Then they start to become memories from far, far away. But in either case, we can chant for them and we can assist them and we can bring peace not only to them, but to ourselves. Because remember, if they have unfinished business, the soul might still be connecting with you in its essence. The soul might still be in the electromagnetic field of Mother Earth, where again, the most important thing to do is ritual. The most important thing to do is light a candle for them. We've done inside of my academy, the last module of the academy is all about cutting ancestral cords. So being aware of where these cords our ancestors are still attached to, especially as it relates to trauma. There's a whole ritual that I created because of my own personal experience on how to cut these cords and release yourselves from these cords, and also to allow the soul, the deceased loved one, the deceased ancestor, to finally leave from the electromagnetic field of Mother Earth and to really continue their path and journey as a powerful ancestor that now helps you and assists you here in this life. So, grief recovery as a process of integration of change is very important through this, because grief recovery for you that stays behind is really about emerging of the spirit of transformation and of integration of the change. I truly do believe everything in this world is healable. Everything in this world is healable. After someone transitions that you love very much, especially if it was tragic, you will not be the same person ever again. But what I mean by healable is that you'll be able to shift your perception to connect to the wisdom and to connect to the gifts that that person left you instead of the pain. And that is totally doable for us, not only spiritually, but scientifically, because we now know that trauma deteriorates the brain, deteriorates the nervous system. Through the practices of Kundalini Yoga, we can not only regrow neurons and cells in the brain, but we can heal the nervous system so that we can process the grief that comes with these incredibly tragic experiences that we go through as a human experience. We have to remember there is a pathway from grief to recovery, and a lot of that is community, because when we're depressed and anxious, we shut down the world around us. Grieving is one experience. Grief recovery is a whole other one. In conscious grief recovery, we recognize that we are fundamentally changed by this experience. And then we integrate that change into a deeper revelation of our spirit, into our true self. And this does not happen in isolation. It occurs in the context of our life, in community. It occurs in our intention with grief recovery. This is why we have to seek out help. It occurs when instead of feeling the loss, sadness, a gap, a longing for what was, we start to feel completeness. We start to feel the merging of the spirit, of the oneness. We start to have a deeper understanding of oneself and contentment for what is. And this is totally possible for all of us. There are some amazing examples of human beings. There was a story recently that I was listening to about a man who lost his daughter very tragically. And absolutely, he had to go through so much of the grief and healing journey. But now he's come to a point of healing where now he assists other parents who also have lost their children. And he comes from such a beautiful, natural state of being where you can totally see and understand that he went through this process of grief to grief recovery. And he talks about all the time how he still connects with his daughter. He still talks to her. And this is not the first person that has told me that. I also had another, when I was a real estate broker, I managed hundreds of agents under me. And there was one man who was very, very special. He lost his son in a car accident too. They were all in a car, and the son was the only one that died. Same situation. He was very devout. He was a religious man, which really helped him, which is awesome. You know, if your religion is going to help you, I'm not saying stop listening to religion. Please, whatever is going to help you, do it. Right? I'm just pointing out the things that religion has taught us that create a lot of guilt and shame. But for him, he connected deeply to our brother Jesus Christ, and he started to teach other parents too. But he wrote books on how his son still speaks to him from the afterlife. And like I shared yesterday, that's evident. I mean, our brother Jesus Christ taught us that you can still communicate with me at all times. His disciples saw him all the time. So, what we need to do as the ones that are left behind in this physical experience is to not run away from the grief recovery process. And like I said, community is huge when it comes to this because it is so easy for the mind to put us back into these programs of fear because so much internally is changing and occurring. It is highly recommended that, especially if you're making major life decisions such as getting married, getting divorced, selling your assets, or moving, that they're not really made for at least the first year following an initial someone's transition. And the reason that is also because what I've heard as it relates to patterns is that the first year you're kind of like in shock. You really don't even know what happened. And then the first year anniversary comes, and that's when the floodgates actually start to open. That's when you are like, oh my God, this really did happen. And that's where the awareness, if you're doing the healing work, will take you into acknowledgement and acceptance. But if we're not doing the healing work, that's where we're going to get stuck. Many lifetimes, this lifetime, it's not worth it. This is where, as a soul and as a woman, you have to start connecting from within. And if you have noticed these signs of depression, of disconnection, of you can't do this alone, this is where you really, really need to reach out for help because your well being is crucial. And one thing that I do know is that our ancestors absolutely lived through us and they want us to live out all those things that they couldn't themselves. And that's the opportunity we have, especially with having breath and having life. So it's very important for us to take care of ourselves. It's very important for us to have an embodied experience of grieving and to address all these different things that come up with the process.
The connection to community is always really helpful. It'll keep you connected to life during moments where you believe the loss has happened, right? And as yogis, we know that in every change there is loss and gain, right? It's the mind's paradox. It's the illusion of this reality. Grief is a normal reaction to loss, right? Or to the perception of loss. But during these initial phases of where the person has transitioned, you yourself stay in this altered state. You know, some people even regress emotionally. So it's normal for you to feel what you feel. I think the biggest obstacle to us of healing is we don't want to feel the anxiety, the sadness. But that's part of the body's mechanism to actually allow yourself to heal and to help you make decisions for yourself and for those around you, those around you, because you know it can really feel very draining emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So we have to really avoid rushing the recovery process. Even with all this information I gave you, I think all of us could say, yeah, easier said than done. The person's not dead. You know, I can still connect with them, but I still feel this physical grief. I still feel completely um, lost. And it's fair and it's okay for you to feel that way. Remember, the whole thing about what I'm talking about this week is to help serve ourselves and to help serve others in a place of from a place of peace and understanding, and from a place of just being able to hold space, because it's really helpful for us to become aware of our own feelings about death, about loss, about the soul. And it's important for us to connect with the purpose of why we have these practices to help us through these very important or very life changing experiences. Meditation, chanting, swimming, being in water, journaling, laughing, talking with others, all of that is healing. All of that is support. And of course, if you need professional help, that's very important too, to seek out and to actually connect with others that can assist you through this, because I believe that in the next 10 years, we'll have a much better understanding, all of us, scientific understanding of the process of death and the afterlife. Yes, 10 years. I really do believe that. But until then, it's important for us to change the relationship we have with God and to learn to value life, because ultimately we know that death is nothing but an illusion. It has been such an honor to share with you this week all of this information as it relates to death. My only intention is to bring hope, faith, equanimity, and maybe even inner peace to those that might be struggling, especially with the lost life or the deceased life of someone you love, or perhaps even an ancestor that has died a long time ago, that died tragically, or died in a way that your lineage still hasn't been able to accept or forgive. When we do this healing work, we're not only rewarded by our own personal healing, but we're rewarded by the liberation of all those ancestors that came before us and all those that will come after us. So I thank you with all of my heart for your courage, for your bravery, and for being a sovereign woman that is ready and willing to disrupt the pattern by healing herself. Now let's all learn to live instead of being afraid of dying. Thank you all so, so much for your beautiful comments, for all of you, the likes. Thank you for subscribing and sharing with others, especially if they themselves are struggling with life transformation. If you have any other questions or comments, please post them below in the YouTube channel video here in the comments. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear your own personal experience, especially if you've gone through a near death experience. Let us know. This is a community that supports all of you in whatever changes you're moving through, and more importantly, disrupting this ancestral karmic patterns of emotional pain. Thank you for you. I'll see you next week.